Welcome to another Big Train Tour at the Colorado Railroad Museum. This month, we'll be taking a look at the Denver HO Model Railroad Club's scale model railroad layout, located in the basement of the museum depot. When it was under construction in the late 1960s, the Colorado Railroad Museum was a much different place. But in the decades since, as the museum itself has grown and changed, this operating layout has continued to serve as one of the museum's most beloved attractions. Hi, I'm Paul Hammett, Executive Director of the Colorado Railroad Museum. Our subject today has been a big part of the museum for over 55 years, and it remains wildly popular with families and especially younger kids visiting the museum. Come join me now as we explore the history of the organization that built this extensive layout, the Denver HO Model Railroad Club, which still maintains and operates it faithfully today. We'll also step back in time and follow the construction of this realistically detailed miniature railroad environment. As long as there have been railroads, there have been toy trains and scale models. The first American railroads began operating in the late 1820s and early 1830s, and not surprisingly, models of early locomotives were being made earlier than you might think. Some highly detailed technical models and others more toy-like. Toy trains were usually created with children in mind, thus they were often colorful and whimsical in their presentation. These early toys were pulled or pushed by hand at first. Then clockwork mechanisms came along as early as the 1850s to provide animation. Standardization for toy trains began as early as the 1880s, led by the German firm of Märklin. The earliest toy train track gauges were quite large by today's standards. Even though it was the smallest of three early standard options, Märklin's Gauge 1, as it was known, was still pretty large. Few people had enough space indoors to build a railway, so some proceeded to take their miniature railroad outdoors. This served as the early precursor to the garden railroading movement, which today has its own following. In the United States, however, miniature trains diverged from European practice. A completely different standardized track gauge, called standard gauge, caught on early in the 20th century. Manufacturer Lionel became its best-known producer, followed by Ives and American Flyer. Most significantly, these miniature trains were promoted for indoor use. Deploying them outdoors was hardly given a thought by the adults and kids who spent time with them. These early model trains were more toys than scale models. As the 20th century progressed, this would slowly change. Scale models intended for use by grown-ups would eventually come to dominate the marketplace. As this transition occurred, models became more and more exact copies of the originals, scaled down to a miniature size. Today's model railroads frequently have more of a focus on the scenery through which trains pass, making for another major distinction in the world of miniaturization. What's the difference when we talk about scale versus when we discuss gauge in miniature railroading? Well, scale refers to the proportion of a model in respect to the original. It's sort of like the size of a model, if you will. Scale is typically expressed in a ratio, such as 1 to 48, which is known as O scale here in the US. The scale we call HO, today the most popular railroad modeling scale, is roughly half the size of O scale at 1 to 87, and that's how it came to be designated as HO. Gauge, on the other hand, is the distance between the rails, the same term that we use in full-size railroading. Gauge tends to have a relationship to scale when it comes to miniatures, but this can vary wildly with model trains and toy trains for a number of reasons. Particularly in more toy-like miniature railroading, a single track gauge can serve as a guideway for trains of several different sizes or scales. Conversely, however, the single scale or ratio can involve different gauges of track and scale modeling. If you stop to consider this for a moment, the same situation arises in full-size or prototype railroading. Think about narrow gauge versus standard gauge tracks and trains, for instance. Colorado's narrow gauge trains may themselves be smaller than their standard gauge counterparts, but are they the same scale? Well, the originals were both full-size, with a 1-to-1 ratio, so of course they are. In model railroading, standard gauge and narrow gauge trains can sometimes be found on the same layout, modeled to the same scale, even though the rails are spaced differently on the tracks. There's one final overarching aspect of model railroading to consider: power and control. The earliest toy trains required someone to push or pull them. They were later powered by a wind-up or clockwork mechanism, which for a time became quite common. Live steam propulsion was yet another option, although much more care had to be taken by operators. But it was the introduction of electricity that truly revolutionized toy trains and allowed for the adoption of scale model railroading as a popular hobby in the second half of the 20th century. The Denver HO Model Railroad Club was formed in 1946 during a time of great change in the U.S. World War II had ended, and the U.S. had emerged as the world's greatest superpower. A post-war housing boom was underway, and the economy was also booming as much of the world rebuilt itself after years of wartime devastation. Model railroading offered a new social outlet that tended to attract single men and married couples, and the creation and growth of model railroad clubs quickly came into vogue. Those who didn't have enough room at home for a private model railroad layout were able to participate in the hobby by banding together with others. For the first couple of years, the Denver HO Club met in various members' basements and at a temporary headquarters in Denver's Cheeseman Park neighborhood. One member recalled that the club referred to this period of time as the sublevel route, moving from one residential basement to another. Then, in 1948, the club relocated its headquarters to an unused coal room in the Izet Auto Body and Repair Shop, located at 1448 Spear Boulevard in Denver. Today, this location is roughly where Auraria Parkway and Spear Boulevard intersect downtown. It was in the Izet Auto Body Shop where an infamous police raid occurred, or at least one that will never be forgotten by club members. It seemed that suspicious neighbors saw men arriving regularly on certain nights and carrying boxes into the building basement. One evening, the Vice Squad arrived and entered with guns drawn, expecting to raid an illegal gaming operation. Fortunately, building a model railroad was not an illegal activity in Denver, so there surely must have been some embarrassed officers. There certainly were some amazed modelers who looked up to find unexpected visitors with full-sized weapons drawn. In 1950, the club moved into the basement of Denver's Mayan Theater, where they stayed for 13 years. This Denver classic, built in 1930, is today one of just 3 remaining theaters in the U.S. designed in the Art Deco Mayan Revival style. But in 1950, it was a booming location showing first-run motion pictures. The theater's basement was quite spacious, and the Model Railroad Club thrived during its tenure at the theater. The layout here featured 10 local control cabs and 4 main control cabs, elevated to gain visibility above the mostly mountainous scenery. It was so large that the main cab operators could not see the entire line, so block occupancy lights were installed as well. A phone system and a dispatcher with a card order system made operating nights interesting. The location under the theater had some peculiar disadvantages, however, noted an article later published in Model Railroading magazine. Frequently, moviegoers upstairs spilled soft drinks which collected along with popcorn and candy wrappers in outdated vents in the floor, which had been capped over with the spring-mounted covers that are often used for old flues. Occasionally, these covers in the ceiling gave way, spilling an avalanche of stale drinks and old popcorn over the layout. It provided instant weathering of the worst sort. The sticky goo was not easy to clean off the structures or rails, especially in the track switches. No prototype equipment could be copied to handle that type of maintenance of way. Another problem with the location was the slope of the ceiling. At the entrance end of the layout, the ceiling was wonderfully airy, but as the floor of the theater sloped toward the screen, the club's ceiling dipped correspondingly downward at the far end of the layout to a head-numbing height. Sheet metal ventilation shafts also dropped in height and featured sharp corners. There was a most devilish spot inside an aisle of the layout where you had to step up and over a barrier in the floor, and as you were looking downward, a cement beam in that lowered ceiling lurked just above to catch your head when you straightened up. The club tried all sorts of warning signs, but sooner or later, most of its members personally experienced just how hard that beam was. After 13 years in the Mayan Theater, the club had built quite a respectable layout. The rental fee for the space had been right too. It was free. But then came another eviction notice in 1963. Many members feared the club was doomed. But as a sign of faith, while the club's members were removing the Mayan layout, they dismantled and saved for storage as much as they could. They investigated alternative locations, but found none they could afford. Luckily, the Denver HO Model Railroad Club ended up in a different sort of arrangement when one of its members offered a deal. In return for club members' help in constructing a layout for his model railroading store, Glenn Brazelton, owner of Caboose Hobbies in Denver, which was then one of the largest model railroading shops in the country, would provide supplies and refreshments. The club could meet regularly and build up funds for the future. During the 4 or so years the club met at this location, its members gained valuable modeling experience and saved up money for whatever the future might hold. A major change occurred in February 1968. Following several months of discussions, Bob Richardson, founder and at the time also executive director of the Colorado Railroad Museum, invited the club to construct a new layout in the basement of the museum's depot building. An O-gauge model railroad club had been attempting to build a layout there previously, but Bob had become frustrated as they were taking far too long. Instead, Richardson made a deal with Irvin Chaim, then president of the Denver HO Model Railroad Club. Chaim had led an interesting life, with his family having fled from the Holocaust in Germany to eventually end up in Denver. He would serve as the HO Club's president for many years, eventually becoming a part-time repairman for Caboose Hobbies after his retirement. The deal struck by Richardson and Chaim would grant the use of the space in the museum's basement so long as the club acted expeditiously and in good faith. When the members of the Denver HO Model Railroad Club first set foot in the depot basement, they were greeted by bare concrete floors and the previous club's unfinished layout benchwork. The unfinished layout was dismantled and removed, and measurements were made so that interior walls could be framed and finished to enclose the space now set aside for the club's HO scale layout. One other major preparatory item was also needed: construction of a viewing aisle. This was separated from the layout itself via a wall fashioned to look like the side of a railroad coach. A window design was concocted that allowed the window sashes to be lowered into hidden recesses, such that they were completely out of the way when modelers needed to access the layout. Planning for the layout began immediately. A design team began plotting track plans on paper. These plans were then visualized in color renderings to show what various areas of the completed plan might look like with scenery and structures added. This whole process gave the club a good opportunity to make design corrections and upgrades before actual construction began. This ended up saving time, money, and effort. The club's members had lots of experience building layouts, gained over the previous 20 years, and they put this experience to work at the new location. Minimum radii for mainline curves was set at 36 inches and narrow gauge at 24 inches. All track would use Code 70 or Code 100 rail made of nickel silver, hand spiked to individual ties supported on underlayment atop L girders. Color coding for electrical wiring was listed and kept in a loose-leaf book for quick reference. A construction technique known as hardshell forms most of the scenery on the club layout. This allows good clearance for those working within the high mountains. Access to the various tracks and areas is provided by long aisles within the layout and a select few pop-up holes that are otherwise disguised to look like the surrounding scenery. Hidden trackage, of which there is a fair amount, is guarded with strips of clear plastic along the sides to prevent any derailed trains from ending up on the floor. Club members worked every Thursday evening and Sunday afternoons as well, until the major work of creating the new layout was complete. The Thursday evening sessions would continue well past 10 p.m. on numerous occasions. These evening work sessions continue up to the present day, as there's always work to be done on a layout this large and complex. Luckily, this busy initial schedule continued only for the club's first 15 months, with the layout finally opening to the public in late 1969. Club members briefly celebrated, then they settled into the work of keeping everything operating on this basement model railroad paradise. The original layout was wired with DC and block controls. Rheostats were used to control the voltage to the track. This essentially translated to low voltage being used for low speeds and higher voltages being used to achieve higher speeds. Control panels with toggle switches indicated which throttle or rheostat was controlling each specific section of the track. Blocks could also be turned off, so no voltage went to a specific section of track, and thus allowing an engine to be parked, or in railroad terms, spotted. 2 throttles or rheostats were wired to each block. One was considered the main, and the other local. By setting the control panel toggle switches so they controlled the main throttle or rheostat across many panels or blocks, a train could be controlled over the entire layout. The club has held regular, structured operation sessions over the years. These were initially held on Tuesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays, with museum visitors able to watch the layout in full operation. Club members that were operating wore radio headphones, which allowed them to talk with a dispatcher. The dispatcher, in turn, controlled what trains were allowed to proceed and what tracks they were authorized to occupy, much like on a real railroad. For a short while, a computer program kept track of the current location of every car on the layout. It would generate train orders so that operators could create trains, and then the program would also specify which cars to drop off or pick up along the route. Each operator would be given a switch list for their train as they began their operations for the session. The computer system couldn't keep on top of all the changing car locations, however, and therefore this didn't last long. In August 1983, an automated coin box was installed. This new feature provided a 3-minute-long runtime for a train operating on trackage closest to the main viewing window after a quarter was deposited. This system was fashioned after the coin box used at that time by the Lionel Train Museum in Naples, Florida. A second coin box located nearby provides a unique opportunity for guests to watch Holly Park in operation. Although these coin boxes were perhaps a seemingly simple upgrade, they were actually transformational. Trains could now operate anytime guests were present, without the need for club members to be there. Thanks to all of the hard planning that had gone into the layout, these automated operations have remained relatively trouble-free over many years. Although there are times when a recurring issue leads to a determination that something needs fixing. As a technical note, whenever the coin box is in operation, the layout continues to operate using the original DC block controls and rheostats. This system can be switched off when the coin boxes are not in use, so operating sessions can utilize a more modern form of train control. In 1996, the club switched over to a DCC system for its operating sessions, with the manufacturer Digitrax chosen for this installation. DCC allows multiple locomotives to be controlled simultaneously, with the tracks powered by a constant 12 to 14 volts at all times. Each locomotive has a computer chip installed, which can read or decode signals overlaid on the track voltage. This allows a specific locomotive to detect when a message is being addressed to it. The chip decodes the messages, which tell the locomotive which direction to go, how fast to go, or when to enable or disable additional functions such as lights, whistles, bells, and other sound effects. A typical operating day begins with cleaning of the tracks. For this, the club employs a variety of track cleaning cars with pads or sponges built in, and utilizing a cleaning solution like alcohol or mineral spirits. Track sometimes also requires cleaning by hand, with foam sponges, pumice stones, or even old wine corks being used. Regular staffed operating sessions have been a feature most every Tuesday and every Saturday during museum hours, and have been since the layout was first completed. Saturdays are something guests can expect for sure, and Tuesdays are usually staffed. Sundays originally were also included, but at some point the club dropped back to just 2 operating days per week. This rhythm was interrupted by the COVID pandemic, but has since resumed. And of course, the layout is usually staffed during major special events, such as Day Out with Thomas, too. Colorado's many railroads are justly famed for conquering massive mountain passes, running through alpine valleys and rugged canyons, and crossing grand prairies. In attempting to capture this spirit in miniature, The Denver HO Model Railroad Club layout has recreated a cross-section of some of the state's most interesting railroad areas, from the Cripple Creek Mining District through the Collegiate Peaks near Buena Vista to Marble Pass near Mount Sopris. On this layout, it's still 1959, the year the Colorado Railroad Museum opened. Most of the trains you see in operation today are owned by the club, but members occasionally bring privately owned examples from home, offering an opportunity for guests to experience railroad locomotives and cars from other eras, both older and newer. The various scenes and railroad environments found on the layout encompass both standard and narrow gauge trackage, as well as a standard gauge interurban electric railway complete with overhead wires. The many buildings and structures on the layout have all been scratch-built or kit-bashed by club members, while the bridges, both wood and metal, were all scratch-built. There are small houses and large false-front buildings, water and coaling towers, stations, mines, gas stations, and many more structures that give this multifaceted railway a reason to exist. Along the front wall, there are cutaways so guests can, for instance, peer inside a mining tunnel. In Victor, near where guests first encounter the layout, electric streetcars from the Intermountain Railway feature intricate overhead wires. Perhaps the most popular attraction is the Town of Calamity. Here, a commercial building is perpetually on fire. In typical dry humor devised by club members, it's the local IRS office. Nearby, a traffic accident ties up an intersection, while a line of miniature people wait to see a feature film at the local movie theater, the Rivoli, where Gone with the Wind and John Wayne are playing. One of the coin-operated items on the layout is also found right here, Holly Park, a scaled-down amusement park complete with a carousel, ice skating rink, a miniature train ride, and more, all of which comes to life when a quarter is inserted. Off to one side, a model plane has crashed, with the pilot parachuting to safety. There's even a drive-in movie theater just outside of town. The folks in Calamity sure do like their Hollywood movies. The constant flow of museum visitors includes numerous regional families with younger children, organized school tour groups, senior tour groups, guests who are attending civic gatherings in the museum's enclosed pavilion, plus tourists and narrow-gauge railroad enthusiasts from all over the U.S. and the world who visit year-round. Most often, model trains and the amusement park are operated by depositing a quarter in the coin box without the need for human operators to be present. But as noted earlier, the Denver HO Model Railroad layout typically comes alive as a staffed operating exhibit every Saturday, most Tuesdays, and also during some of the museum's signature special events. Of these, Day Out with Thomas and other kid-themed events, such as Dinosaur Express Train and the Harvest Haunt Express, bring out the biggest crowds. Club members delight in being present to operate trains on these days when there are so many appreciative viewers watching. Behind the scenes, the Denver HO Model Railroad Club also hosts monthly meetings. These meetings consist of member-run clinics, demonstrations, and sharing of modeling techniques by certified master modelers and other members of the group. These meetings help keep the club and its members connected to the ongoing evolution of the hobby of model railroading, which continues to change over time and with new innovations. Over the years, the relationship between the HO Model Railroad Club and the museum has grown into a partnership. A substantial proportion of club members also serve as Railroad Museum volunteers, supporting special events such as the Polar Express train ride and Day Out with Thomas, volunteering as researchers and archivists in the Richardson Library, and helping to lead guided tours and other interpretive and educational programming efforts. The Colorado Railroad Museum is proud of the many accomplishments of Denver HO Model Railroad Club members and is looking forward to its long-running partnership with the club continuing for benefit of model railroaders as well as museum guests well into the future. And that's something that museum guests, both young and old, very much can appreciate. Thanks for joining me today. The Colorado Railroad Museum today is known for housing Colorado's most comprehensive collection of historic railroad locomotives, cars, and smaller artifacts at its campus in Golden's beautiful Clear Creek Valley. As the museum has grown and prospered, however, it has also become known not only for its full-size trains, but also for so much more. The massive HO layout that is maintained and operated by the Denver HO Model Railroad Club is one example, along with the extensive outdoor garden railroad overseen by the Denver Garden Railway Society. Rounding out these small wonders are changing exhibits, seasonal interpretive programs, steam-ups, and signature events which are held throughout the year. We'd also be remiss if we didn't mention the Robert W. Richardson Library, which serves as a portal for researchers looking to access the museum's extensive archival collections. Many of these researchers are, you guessed it, model railroaders, seeking out authentic details to faithfully recreate locomotives, cars, and structures from Colorado's famed railroading past. I hope you've enjoyed this history and brief tour of the Denver HO Model Railroad Club's layout at the museum and the stories behind its construction, ongoing maintenance, and operation. I also hope that your appreciation for Colorado's rich railroad heritage continues to grow with each and every tour of the museum's collection.
Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Commenting and sharing in particular may qualify as virtual engagements for important funding programs like the SCFD.